Imagine standing on a stretch of desert east of Cairo, the wind pulling sand across your boots, and being told that beneath your feet lie hundreds of tanks. Not wrecks, not rusted hulks left over from a battle. Whole tanks, engines intact, guns never fired in anger, buried on purpose by the very army that built them in the final months of the Second World War. For decades, this story has circulated among tank collectors, military historians, and desert wanderers in Egypt. The legend of 500 Sherman tanks, entombed in the sand near Tel el Kebir, deliberately hidden from the world. Is it true? Is it exaggeration? Or is it something in between, a kernel of real wartime chaos wrapped in 80 years of retelling? What actually happened to Britain's surplus armor in Egypt is stranger, and in some ways more revealing, than the legend itself. To understand it, you have to go back to a desert base most people have never heard of, and a mountain of steel that nobody in London quite knew what to do with. By 1945, Egypt was not just a battlefield memory. It was Britain's single largest overseas military storage system in the Middle East, a sprawling network of depots built to keep the 8th Army supplied through years of desert warfare against Rommel's Afrika Korps. At the center of it sat Tel el Kebir, a name that meant little to most Britons back home, but everything to the quartermasters trying to run a war from 100 miles of tents, workshops, and rail sidings east of Cairo. This was where American-built Sherman tanks arrived by the shipload, starting in 1942, where British engineers welded on sand shields and modified turrets for desert combat, and where thousands of vehicles were serviced, repaired, and sent back into the fight. At its peak, Tel el Kebir wasn't a battlefield. It was a small industrial city built entirely to keep an army moving. The scale is difficult to picture today. Convoys stretched for miles, workshops ran around the clock. British and Commonwealth mechanics, many barely out of their teens, learned to strip and rebuild American engines they'd never seen a manual for, because the war didn't wait for training courses. And it worked. The Sherman, despite its flaws, became the backbone of British armoured divisions from El Alamein through Tunisia and beyond, and Egypt was the workshop that kept it running. But wars end, and when they do, the machinery built to feed them doesn't simply switch off. It grinds to a confused, expensive halt. That's what happened after 1945. The empire that had shipped thousands of tanks into the desert now had no idea what to do with the ones still sitting there. Britain didn't just build tanks for North Africa, it built an entire logistics organism, one designed to consume steel and fuel and produce combat readiness. When Germany surrendered in May and Japan followed in August, that organism didn't have an off switch. Orders that had been placed months earlier kept arriving. Spare parts kept shipping, and somewhere in the pipeline, hundreds of Sherman tanks that had been manufactured, shipped, and delivered to Egypt for a war that no longer existed were simply there, sitting on hard stands, sitting in depot yards, never issued to a single unit, never fired a shot. Picture the summer of 1945 through the eyes of a British quartermaster stationed at Tel el Kebir. The war he'd spent years organizing supply chains for has simply stopped. Not slowed down, stopped almost overnight. Britain finished the Second World War with more military equipment than any government on earth knew how to store, sell, or dispose of. Across the empire, the same scene repeated itself. Aircraft stacked wingtip to wingtip on runways with nowhere to fly, artillery pieces lined up in fields, and tanks, thousands of them, parked in rows that stretched toward the horizon. The financial reality made the problem worse. Britain emerged from the war essentially bankrupt, propped up by American loans and desperate to convert wartime spending into peacetime recovery. Every tank sitting idle in an Egyptian depot wasn't just scrap metal. It represented money the Treasury didn't have and couldn't easily recover. Selling surplus armor abroad required political approval, export licenses, and buyers willing to pay in hard currency Britain actually needed. Scrapping it for steel took time, labor, and functioning smelting operations, none of which Egypt's desert depots were built for. Shipping it home cost more than the tanks were worth in a country already flooded with its own surplus. Every option had a price tag Britain could barely afford, and every month of delay made the pile bigger. Meanwhile, geopolitics in Egypt was shifting under Britain's feet. Egyptian nationalism was rising fast, and the British military presence, technically justified by wartime treaty arrangements, was becoming a political liability rather than a strategic asset. London knew, even in 1945, that its grip on Egyptian bases wouldn't last forever. That knowledge changed the calculus entirely. Why invest heavily in transporting tanks back to Britain, or maintaining a permanent depot structure in a country that might expel British forces within a decade? The pragmatic officers on the ground faced an impossible three-way choice. Spend money you don't have moving the tanks, spend money you don't have maintaining them indefinitely, or find the cheapest possible way to make the problem disappear. And in the desert, disappear had a very literal meaning. Reports from the period, patchy, incomplete, scattered across regimental diaries and later recollections rather than a single clean archive, describe surplus vehicles being driven into depressions in the desert floor, stripped of anything valuable or classified, and covered over. Whether this was official ministry policy or the improvised solution of overwhelmed local commanders trying to clear space and cut guard duty costs is exactly where the historical record gets thin, and exactly where the legend of the 500 was born. Something was buried in that desert. The real question the record can't fully settle is how much and why. To understand how a decision like that could even happen, you need to understand who was actually making choices in 1945. And it wasn't the generals who'd led the Desert War. Those men had already gone home, reassigned to occupation duties in Germany, or demobilized entirely. The people left holding the surplus problem were quartermasters, ordnance officers, and regional commanders working with fractured instructions from a war office trying to manage disposal across 5 continents at once. London's official position, as far as the paper trail shows, was disposal through sale wherever possible. The Ministry of Supply and the War Office set up surplus disposal boards tasked with converting military hardware into cash, selling to allied nations, to newly forming post-colonial armies, to private scrap dealers, to anyone willing to pay. Egypt itself would eventually become a buyer, not just a dumping ground. British surplus Shermans sold to Italy in the late 1940s were later rerouted to Cairo, and by the early 1950s the Egyptian army had assembled a small Sherman fleet, probably under 150 tanks in total, built substantially from exactly this kind of post-war disposal stock. That's a documented, traceable transaction. Officially then, the plan was never to bury usable tanks. The plan was to sell them. But official plans and desert reality rarely matched. Disposal boards worked at the speed of paperwork, and paperwork moved slower than the pressure building at forward depots. Local commanders needed space. They needed to reduce guard rosters protecting equipment nobody had authorized them to release. They needed to demonstrate to inspectors that stockpiles were shrinking, not sitting untouched month after month. And crucially, some of what sat in those Egyptian depots wasn't glamorous, export-ready armor. It was equipment already showing the wear of years in desert conditions, vehicles with sand-damaged engines, cannibalized parts, or designs already considered obsolete next to newer Cromwell and Centurion tanks entering service. Not every surplus tank was a pristine, combat-ready Sherman waiting for a buyer. Some were closer to scrap that happened to still have a hull. That distinction matters enormously, because it's where the legend and the paperwork start to diverge. The claim of 500 tanks, brand new and unused, deliberately entombed to hide them from the world, doesn't match any surviving Ministry of Supply disposal record. What the record does support is smaller-scale burial or abandonment of degraded, low-priority equipment as a stopgap disposal method at forward depots. Not a secret, centrally planned operation, but the kind of improvised, undocumented decision that happens when overstretched officers are told to make a problem go away and given no budget to do it properly. So why does the number 500 persist? Partly because round numbers travel further than precise ones. Partly because Egypt's shifting political landscape after 1952, when the monarchy fell and British influence collapsed further, meant that many of the officers and records involved simply scattered, taking institutional memory with them rather than leaving it behind for historians. And partly, frankly, because a story about hundreds of pristine tanks hidden under the sand is a better story than the messier truth. That Britain's surplus disposal in Egypt was less a conspiracy and more a slow-motion improvisation made by exhausted men trying to solve an unsolvable math problem with no money and no time. The debate wasn't really buried versus sold. It was 100 small, undocumented decisions made by different officers at different depots, each one just trying to get through the week. So what actually happened to Britain's surplus Sherman fleet in Egypt once the dust, literally, began to settle? The honest answer is several things at once, and tracing all of them tells you more about post-war disposal than any single dramatic image of buried tanks ever could. A significant number were sold. This is the best documented path because sales generate paperwork, and paperwork survives. Britain sold surplus Shermans across the Mediterranean and Middle East through the late 1940s. Italy received batches of ex-British M4A2 and M4A4 Shermans, some of which were later diverted, sometimes through backdoor political pressure, toward Egypt rather than their originally intended buyer. By 1948, under an arms embargo that both Israel and Egypt were technically bound by, Britain forced Italy into an agreement to sell dozens of ex-British Shermans specifically to Egypt, even while Italy privately favored the other side of the conflict brewing in Palestine. Surplus tanks, in other words, didn't just disappear. Some of them became instruments of Cold War-era Middle Eastern politics, years before the Cold War had a name most people would recognize. Other tanks were scrapped outright, fed into local metal recycling operations, or shipped to scrap dealers who saw a Sherman hull as raw steel first, and a piece of history a distant second. Some were converted for civilian and semi-military use, stripped of turrets and weapons, and repurposed as recovery vehicles, engineering platforms, or training hulks for mechanics who needed something to practice on that wasn't a live combat vehicle. Some simply rotted in depot yards for years, victims of bureaucratic limbo rather than any deliberate decision, until later disposal boards finally processed what earlier ones had left behind. And yes, some were buried or driven into natural depressions and covered with sand, particularly vehicles judged not worth the cost of transport or repair. Veterans' accounts and regimental histories, fragmentary as they are, describe this happening at multiple points across North African depots in the years immediately following the war, not just in Egypt. It wasn't unique to Tel el Kebir, and it wasn't secret in the sense of a hidden conspiracy. It was simply unrecorded, the kind of local, practical decision nobody thought was significant enough to formally document, because at the time, nobody imagined future collectors and historians would care. The tanks that vanished into the sand weren't hidden from history. They were simply beneath history's notice at the time. Nobody in 1945 thought a Sherman tank buried outside Tel el Kebir would matter to anyone 80 years later. The war was over. The priority was space, budget, and moving on. It's only decades later, with tank collecting and historical preservation transformed into passionate global hobbies, that these forgotten disposal decisions take on the weight of mystery and legend. There's also a quieter, sadder layer to this story worth sitting with. Some of the men doing this disposal work had spent years keeping these exact tanks running through combat, patching engines, replacing tracks, sometimes under fire. For them, watching serviceable machines they'd fought to maintain get pushed into a pit and covered with sand wasn't bureaucracy. It was something closer to grief. A handful of post-war letters and memoirs from former REME mechanics describe exactly that feeling. Watching hardware they'd personally kept alive through the desert campaign simply discarded once the fighting stopped, with no ceremony and no acknowledgement of what it had cost to keep it running. Beyond the core disposal story, a handful of smaller, stranger threads run through this history, details that rarely make it into the headline version of the legend, but that reward anyone willing to dig a little deeper. First, Tel el Kebir wasn't just a Sherman story. It briefly held some of the last operational examples of much older equipment too, including obsolete tank types being cycled out of frontline service years before the war ended, quietly stored alongside the newer American armor because nobody had gotten around to processing their disposal either. Post-war surplus wasn't a single wave. It was layers of unresolved inventory stacking on top of each other for years. Second, some of the surplus Shermans that eventually reached Egyptian hands weren't purchased directly at all. They were smuggled, redirected, or diplomatically maneuvered around arms embargoes, particularly in the tense years surrounding the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict. British forces at one point intercepted Shermans that Italy had attempted to sell to Israel and rerouted them to Egypt instead, enforcing the embargo selectively in a way that shaped the balance of Middle Eastern armored forces for the following decade. Third, junkyards, not just desert pits, played an enormous role in the story of the vanished tanks. Evacuated British ordnance dumps in Palestine, closely linked to the same regional supply network as the Egyptian depots, became scavenging grounds for the newly forming Israeli military in 1948. Fitters roaming abandoned equipment heaps under fire, dragging usable parts back to workshops to build tanks essentially from scavenged scraps, sometimes using track plates the British themselves had laid out on beaches for vehicle movement. Fourth, the tanks that did survive in Egyptian service went on to fight in wars. Most people don't associate with Sherman tanks at all. The 1956 Suez Crisis, and in modified form through French conversions elsewhere in the region, conflicts stretching into the late 1960s. A tank built in an American factory in 1943 for combat against the Wehrmacht could, through the strange path of post-war surplus, end up on a very different battlefield more than a decade later. Fifth, and perhaps strangest of all, nobody has ever conducted a comprehensive, verified archaeological or ground-penetrating survey of the Tel el Kebir area, specifically to confirm or refute the buried tank legend at scale. Isolated recovery efforts and individual finds have occurred in various former depot regions across North Africa over the decades, but there's no single definitive dig that has either proven or disproven the specific claim of hundreds of tanks in one location. The legend survives, in part, simply because nobody has definitively closed the case. The legacy of this story reaches further than a patch of Egyptian desert. It's a case study in what happens at the exact seam between war and peace, the moment when a machine built entirely for destruction suddenly has no purpose, and the people responsible for it have neither the money nor the mandate to handle that transition gracefully. Every war in the modern era has produced its own version of this problem, from Vietnam-era equipment abandoned across Southeast Asia to Cold War stockpiles quietly decommissioned across Eastern Europe after 1991. The Sherman tanks of Tel el Kebir are simply one of the earliest, best-remembered examples of a pattern that has repeated itself again and again. It also shaped the modern military collector's world in ways still visible today. Surviving Shermans recovered from North African depots, scrapyards, and former battlefield sites have become prized museum pieces and private restoration projects, valued not just as machines, but as physical evidence of exactly this messy post-war transition. Institutions from the Imperial War Museum to smaller regional collections across the Middle East and Europe hold surplus Shermans with provenance tracing directly back to this exact disposal chaos. Tanks that survived the pits, the scrap dealers, and the decades simply by chance. captures something true about how empires end, not with dramatic final battles, but with quartermasters staring at spreadsheets they can't balance, making small, forgettable decisions that outlive them by 80 years. The desert outside Tel el Kebir isn't just sand. It's an unmarked ledger of a war's final, unglamorous chapter. The chapter nobody photographed, nobody documented properly, and nobody expected anyone to care about. So what do we actually know? We know Tel el Kebir was real, and it was enormous, a genuine industrial engine that kept British armor running through some of the war's most brutal desert fighting. We know that when the war ended, Britain was left holding more military hardware than it could sell, ship, or store, and that Egypt's depots became one of the pressure points where that crisis played out. We know tanks were sold, tanks were scrapped, tanks were repurposed, and hung by multiple fragmentary but consistent accounts, some tanks were buried. What we don't know, and may never know with certainty, is whether the number was 500 or 50, or somewhere else entirely, because the men who made that call in 1945 weren't writing history. They were just trying to get through the week, with no idea that decades later people would still be searching the sand for their answer. Maybe that's the real reason this story refuses to die. It isn't really about the tanks, it's about how easily something enormous, a war machine, an empire, an entire way of life, can end not with a bang, but with a shovel and a stretch of empty desert. If you found this one as strange and unresolved as we did, there are other forgotten chapters of post-war military history just like it. Stories buried not under sand, but under decades of paperwork nobody bothered to keep. Subscribe if you want to keep digging with us, because somewhere out there, another pile of steel is still waiting to be found.